Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. As, as Patricia kindly already said, I'm a new immigrant to Canada, 3 weeks new. I was actually, maybe I need to clarify, I'm now the Canada Excellence Researcher in Migration and Integration at Ryerson. And I've given up my previous job, which was at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. And maybe I need to say I'm Greek by origin, but have lived in different European countries in my adult life. So I guess I bring to my migration research also my personal experience of moving and that of my family. And then to our experiences we're at in now Canada, which is really quite different after crossing the Atlantic. Keith Banting persuaded me to come to this conference, telling me, don't worry, number crunchers, yeah, exactly. Social policy people also like narratives. So what I'll try to do, I don't think I'll offer some solutions. What I'm offering is raising some questions and illustrating in front of you some of the European experiences to the extent that these can serve as a point of reflection. And I understand that in many things probably Canada is well ahead, but in other things maybe the EU context can give ideas of how to work with these complex challenges. And I think although it might not seem at first, in first instance that our presentations are related, I think truly they are. So just a few words about the context in Europe that you probably know, the context of the last 5, if not 10 years, international. And although migrant integration is not about terrorism, it somehow, of course, in the political discourse gets contaminated. So the context has really been marked by a significant rise in international, mostly jihadist terrorism, but also some kind of racist, white supremacist violence, the refugee emergency, and I also refuse to call it a crisis of 2015 onwards, although it hasn't been absent. Pressures across the Mediterranean have been there at least since the mid-2000s. And a more long-term discussion of the last 20 years, the crisis or non-crisis of multiculturalism, and actually the notion of super diversity, which in sociology is more descriptive to say, and I think in many ways it would probably describe Canada very well. So the idea that we can no longer speak about groups because people are so diverse, they through intermarriage and through living together, you can't take anyone being the carrier of their culture. So even saying you're Greek Canadian, what does it mean? Let alone saying you're Canadian or you are Greek or you are Jamaican. So the answers in Europe have gravitated towards 2 areas. I'll speak about the second. So one has been, and I think that is also interesting, about how to do integration tests before even people arrive. So do language tests and knowledge about the country and showing women, pictures of women taking sunbathing topless and say, do you feel comfortable with that? But this is another interesting chapter that we can talk about on another occasion. I would like to focus today on mainstream and integration that has been seen as a very promising avenue, kind of taking away the spotlight from diversity and from migrants being a burden for the welfare system and saying, okay, let's address this holistically as a societal issue. Now, I think this has happened in the context of some pressures from below. I'll talk about pressures from below or above, but I'm not sure what is below and what is above. So pressures from below has been a conspicuous rise of far-right parties and movements and xenophobic nationalism, chauvinistic nationalism. Europe has been experiencing a significantly increased intra-EU mobility, particularly after 2004 and 2007 with the so-called Big Bang enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe. Even though still, well, we know migrants are a small minority in the world population, and even intra-EU migrants, I mean, in total, counting both EU citizens and non-EU citizens, you don't go beyond like 6 or 7%. But the citizens of the new member states have been more mobile than the citizens of the old member states. So that has made this pretty visible. Then we still have, of course, in most EU countries, local challenges of migrant integration, so people not in education and not in employment. This is often territorially concentrated in some city areas. In some countries, it's the inner city areas. In some others, it's the suburbs, the banlieue. And at the same time, I think we've had the rise of of cities as important actors in this, where cities have been saying, I'm less concerned exactly about the national level, or if you want the federal level of border management. I'm more concerned, what do I do with people who live here, both my own residents, but also newcomers, and I cannot leave them on the streets. And I think super diversity has to come here as the context, because it is, many people have been arguing that we need to break down this idea of ethnic groups or immigrant populations in different, again, European countries. Different terms are used. In Britain you'd talk about ethnic minorities, but in many other countries you wouldn't use such terms. But also the idea exactly that cities are faced with many different nationalities, many languages, many issues, many backgrounds. Now, talking about pressures from above, I think, and meaning from above, I think what I had in mind was more structural pressures, or more pressures that don't have directly to do with migration and diversity. And obviously, the financial crisis and the fear that this can come back, and the idea that we have to cut public spending in the EU. Unlike in the United States in the recent past, the crisis has been met with fiscal austerity big time, rather than with Keynesian expansion. And in that context, integration policies seem to be a luxury. And they have also triggered some discourses like, if we don't spend money on our own disabled people, or on our own poor people, on our own kids, in poor families, why should we spend money to the newcomers? And there the picture is often very much confused. Who do you mean when you say newcomers? Do you mean people who have been there for 10 years, or do you mean people arriving, in the last couple of years through the refugee emergency? And there has been in some countries a strong resentment that is not corroborated by data, that intra-EU migrants use disproportionately welfare resources, and that relatively generous welfare provisions, say in Germany or in Britain, are a big attraction for intra-EU mobility. I think this is something that has not been confirmed by relevant studies, although of course relevant studies, and I think somebody said it earlier or this morning, I mean, the picture we know is mixed. It's not that migration is just completely a blessing. It's not completely a problem. So you have probably spending in the first years, but you have positive balance in the later years. Or young people don't use the health resources, but maybe they use employment support. And kids use schools, and it's a very mixed picture. But the discourse had it, we have to keep, there was a lot of welfare chauvinism in the discourse. So I think that has prepared the ground for saying, okay, we go to a point of integration 2.0 in Europe. This is no longer about integrating migrants or ethnic minorities. We need to, the way to go is to mainstream. And I think gender mainstreaming has been pretty much, the example that was thought of, that like with gender equality policies, we've moved from an idea that gender is a specific policy domain to an idea that gender should be present everywhere, that migrant integration should be present everywhere, in housing, in education, in employment support, but we shouldn't have special services for migrants, but we should just integrate them. I think what is interesting to say is, of course, there's a clear shift in the target, and in that sense, there is something positive in that there is no singling out, these ethnic communities are problematic, this ethnicity or this religion is problematic. On the other hand, unlike gender, here diversity is hidden. The idea is we shouldn't talk about diversity. We should forget about it and just say these are poor people, are disadvantaged people, are less educated, or people who are difficult to retrain, they have poor housing. While in gender policies, what we say, it's because of gender that we're doing this. So clearly here, I think the political context is different. Now, just briefly looking at two examples, one taken from France and another from the Netherlands. I think France, and through the Republican model, has for long been very reticent to speak about ethnic diversity, and you might know that in the last 5 or 6 years there's been a very intensive debate of whether France should keep ethnic statistics, and the decision so far is no. Because people say this is a source of discrimination. At the same time, if you don't have this kind of statistics, you cannot know what is the role of discrimination or what is the role of ethnic background in the outcome of your different policies. So this has been very much the zone policy and the politique de la ville. And one good example is what happened in schools. Instead of targeting, populations of migrant origin that were not doing well in school, the idea was we target a zone that has significant poverty and unemployment, where kids don't do well in schools, housing is poor. And for instance, to schools, we give a lot more funding and a lot more support. But what happens is oftentimes schools found themselves isolated because this was very centralized and it was not necessarily well coordinated with the cities. So there have been mixed results. Another idea has been to speak about priority neighborhoods, and what we have seen is this has worked well, for instance, in cities like Lyon, that took a very active and positive approach to this, but in other cities it just meant you lost the funding and you lost the support on integration policies, but you didn't get much in return. I think these are good examples of the mixed bag of solutions that you have when you move from a group-based to an area-based approach. The Netherlands is another interesting example where cities have taken perhaps the leadership, particularly Amsterdam and Rotterdam, saying, you know what, we are different from the rest of the country and we want to be proactive and we want to implement our own policies, and particularly we want to do this also at a level of identity and belonging, kind of speak of city citizenship. And I have to say in parentheses that this has been also at least a discourse, if not tangibly a social policy reality in many cities across Europe, to say, regardless of what our national government is doing, we want to be more inclusive because this is our city, this is our people, and we're not responsible for border management, but we are here, to create communities. Now, for instance, what this has meant in the Netherlands is that instead of looking as before whether your parents are Moroccan or Turkish, you're looking at the level of education of the parents and you check what is the level of education of the parents and how kids are doing in school. Now, this is probably a very good approach to, as I said, de-ethnicize, decouple disadvantage from ethnicity or also religion. At the same time, the question arises, does this work better? And I think we're here to see. What I want to highlight that might be relevant for the Canadian context is that the cities that have been more active and more successful in these area-based approaches have been large but not mega cities. There are not cities the size of Toronto. There are cities like the size of 1 million or 1.5 million, like Lyon or Amsterdam or Rotterdam. And I wonder whether this is something that we can discuss, of whether this works best when you have a large city but not too large. Now, speaking about the promises and the risks involved in this, as I said, sometimes this can help de-ethnicize the discourse, and particularly in Europe now helps put religion on the side, because more than ethnicity today, it seems that the fault line is religion. But it has a flip side, which is, does it dismantle all the ethnic community representation and all the associations that are migrant or ethnicity based that are doing a very important work of support and that were funded by integration funds and that we're working with agencies like IRCC here? So what does this mean? Do you require a whole reorientation of civil society, and what happens after that? So that is, and what happens particularly if the tide changes in a particular city and you get a government, like in the province of Ontario, so you get a government that takes funds away from that and doesn't care about migrant integration, sees it as a problem. Now, on the other hand, I want to bring to your attention the extent to which the EU level brings here a promise, speaking about the promise of inclusive prosperity. Because the EU level, there is a lot of programs funded by the European Commission, which very much target cooperation and exchanges and working together between cities and between regions, or rather among cities and among regions, bypassing the national level. And this has been going on at least for a good 20, 25 years. So you find a medium-sized town in Italy that is working closely with a medium-sized town in, say, Denmark or Germany on specific issues that could be education or housing or employment projects. So they learn from each other, and there is a lot of potential and there is a lot of positive outcome through networking. And some scholars now speak, since we scholars have always to make things more complex than they are. In reality, we no longer speak about multi-level, that would be understood in this sense, but we speak about multi-scholar, which I imagine, what I try to picture here is like parallel networks. So that where actually cities, particularly medium-sized, as I said, cities, do not need to go up their regional hierarchy and then their federal level, or in some countries directly from the local to the national, but they can work with other cities that share similar problems. And of course, countries that are new to immigration, to hosting immigrants, can avoid some of the errors of countries that have a longer experience. Now, the challenge, of course, for the future is that I think maybe too much talk about mainstreaming and the fact that diversity is so diversified that we can no longer speak actually about diversity will lead to hiding the problem. So it becomes, so to speak, we're all too diverse to matter. So at the end of the day, it's not about integration. It's just about societal problems. And instead of, we move from the problem of recognition to the politics of denial. I think that is the main risk. And coming to not so much my proposals, but my points for reflection on, or what we need to pay attention to in Europe, and I believe also in North America, is first of all, as I said, does this mainstreaming mean that we want to deny diversity? Or does it mean that we want to say diversity is part of us, is part of our society, is part of our identity? I would believe in Canada the question is more towards, yeah, it's part of us. I think in Europe it's pretty ambivalent, it's pretty undecided. And while on one hand, in some of my past research, speaking with people working in the equality bodies, actually one public servant who was a woman said, you researchers, you shouldn't demand too much. This is relatively new in the EU. It is a policy, strong anti-discrimination policies are there since 1990. It's relatively new. Look at gender. It has been with us for 50 years. Have we solved all the problems? Yes, but I think the challenge here now is that while for gender we all agree, for diversity many people think it's a problem rather than a solution. Second, what do we do with complexity and intersectionality? What do we do, for instance, exactly when race, ethnicity, religion, and gender come together? And how do we make justice to people that face multiple barriers? What happens with investment? So when you mainstream, on one hand, you think that might be less. It is a less vulnerable situation. So when you have a change in government, of course, you can have a change in your social policy direction, but you would be less vulnerable to a conservative, say, government that comes to power and cuts everything on migrant integration. On the other hand, you may still see that investment is not strong enough. And for instance, what will cities do when national, or what would be here provincial and federal investment is lacking? And what I'm told, Ontario is a good test case for the last couple of years and the years to come. And just the last question that is, of course, an important question in Europe these days, as I said, because of the whole ISIS, the visibility of the ISIS and international terrorism question is, what do you do with those left behind? Is there, in mainstream and integration, speaking about a territorial approach, what happens with these Belgian or French banlieues and these young people that are not in education, not in employment? They are citizens, but they feel very much discriminated, and of course a handful of them, not many, but just a handful take up terrorism. And is it a good way? Is it a good approach to mainstream, or are you losing contact with your communities in the territory? And this is, the end of my presentation. I look forward to your questions.